The backwater lay apart from the river. It formed where the main current bent sharply and lost pressure, leaving behind a shallow pocket of slow-moving water edged by reeds and half-submerged roots. Here, the river did not push forward. It paused, folded in on itself, and waited. The heron stood at its edge. One leg was submerged, the other drawn up beneath his body, feathers fluffed just enough to trap warmth without breaking outline. His neck curved into a loose S-shape, head angled downward, bill pointed toward the water but not touching it. He had been there a long time. Stillness did not mean inactivity, it meant alignment. The heron's body adjusted constantly in ways too small to notice, minute shifts of balance, tiny corrections to counter ripple and wind. His eyes, pale and unblinking, tracked movement beneath the surface that never broke it. The water was unusually clear. Recent rain upstream had flushed sediment through the main channel, but this backwater had been spared. Here, particles settled instead of travelling onward. Light penetrated deeper, revealing stones, leaf fragments, and the faint shadows of small fish holding position near the bottom. The current turned quiet. Not stopped, reorganized. Instead of pushing, it curled gently along the edge, drawing water inward and then releasing it again in slow cycles. This mattered. Fish used these pockets to rest, to feed, to pause between efforts. The heron knew this place. He had returned to it many times across seasons, sometimes finding nothing, sometimes finding more than enough. He did not expect abundance. He expected possibility. A small fish shifted near a cluster of submerged stems. It moved sideways, not forward, adjusting position against a barely perceptible pull. Its body flashed once as it turned, then settled again, nearly invisible against the mottled bottom. The heron's head moved, not quickly, just enough to refine angle. Depth perception underwater was unreliable. Refraction bent distance, stretched space. The heron compensated by waiting, allowing movement to repeat, confirming pattern before committing. The wind dropped. Reeds along the bank stopped whispering. The water's surface smoothed further, reflections sharpening into pale sky and dark stems. Sound thinned until even insects hesitated to break it. This was the condition he waited for. The heron leaned forward slightly, shifting weight onto the submerged leg. His raised foot tightened against his body, reducing drag. Muscles along his neck coiled without visible tension. He did not strike yet. A quiet current did not guarantee an easy catch. Fish in backwater moved differently, slower but more alert, tuned to the smallest pressure change. The heron waited for a mistake. The fish rose a fraction higher, drawn toward a drifting insect trapped at the surface film. It paused beneath it, body angled upward, tail making small corrective motions. The heron's bill lowered another degree. The world narrowed. Nothing else mattered. Not the open river beyond the reeds, not the distant sound of water over stone, not the sky reflected in the surface. Only distance, angle, timing. The strike would be brief. Either it would end everything, or it would end nothing at all. The current remained quiet, and in that quiet, the heron stood perfectly balanced between water that moved and water that waited, knowing that stillness here was not absence. It was preparation. The strike began before the water reacted. The heron's neck unfolded in a smooth linear motion, not fast at first, but precise. Muscles released stored tension evenly, driving the head forward and down along a path already measured. There was no hesitation, no correction, mid-movement. The decision had been made earlier. The bill entered the water, not with a splash, with a cut. Surface tension broke cleanly around the narrow point, folding inward instead of exploding outward. For a fraction of a second, the water seemed to accept the intrusion, closing around it without protest. Below the surface, everything distorted. Light bent sharply. Stones shifted position. The fish's outlines stretched and compressed at once, its real position diverging from its visible one. This was the moment where most strikes failed, where instinct trusted sight too much. The heron did not. He aimed where the fish would be, not where it appeared. The bill closed, not hard, exact. Resistance travelled up through bone and muscle, a brief, unmistakable signal. The fish kicked once, violently, tail beating water into sudden chaos. Ripples radiated outward, colliding with the reeds, bouncing back toward the point of impact. The current broke its quiet. The heron lifted his head. Water streamed from his bill and neck, droplets catching light as they fell back into the backwater. For a moment, it was unclear whether he held anything at all. Then the fish twisted into view, small, silver, alive. Its body bent sharply, trying to escape the grip, scales flashing as it fought. The heron adjusted instantly, shifting the fish deeper into his bill's hold, rotating it slightly to control movement without crushing. He did not swallow yet. He stepped backward, lifting the submerged leg free of the water and placing it carefully on firmer ground. The backwater churned briefly where he had stood, disturbed sediment clouding clarity that had taken hours to settle. The fish struggled again. The heron shook his head once, not violently, just enough to disrupt the rhythm of resistance. The movement stunned rather than killed, interrupting the fish's coordination. Still, he waited. Swallowing too early risked escape. The fish needed to be aligned head first, fins folded, body straight. The heron adjusted his grip millimetre by millimetre, allowing gravity to assist rather than force. Around him, the backwater continued to change. Ripples spread and faded. Sediment began to settle again, though the surface never fully returned to its earlier stillness. The quiet had been broken. It would not fully return today. When the fish stopped struggling, the heron tilted his head upward. The swallow was slow and deliberate. The fish slid down his throat in a visible motion, leaving a brief outline beneath the feathers before disappearing entirely. The heron paused afterward, head raised, throat working once more to complete the passage. Then he stood still. No triumph, no urgency, just recalibration. The backwater no longer offered the same conditions. Fish that remained had felt the disruption. Pressure had changed. Movement would be more cautious now, or absent altogether. The heron knew this. He stepped back into the shallows again, reclaiming his original position with minimal disturbance. One leg submerged, the other drawn up. Neck relaxed, eyes scanning. He would wait again. Not because he expected another strike soon, but because places that gave once sometimes gave again, and because leaving too quickly often meant missing what followed disturbance. The current did not resume its earlier pattern. It remained altered, quieter in some places, restless in others. And the heron, standing where water had already answered once, waited to see whether the backwater would settle enough to speak again, or whether its silence had already been spent. The light shifted first, not dramatically, just enough to matter. The sun climbed higher, lifting itself above the line of trees that had filtered its early reach. Reflections on the water sharpened, then flattened, glare replacing depth. The heron felt the change immediately. It altered contrast. It erased shadow lines beneath the surface that had helped define distance and movement. Stones blurred together. Fish shapes lost their edges. What had been readable became approximate. The heron remained. He did not reposition immediately. Sudden movement after a strike often drew attention from places where none had existed before. Instead, he stood still, allowing the backwater to adjust around him, to settle into its new balance. Sediment continued to fall. Particles disturbed by the earlier strike drifted slowly downward, clouding the lower water column in a thin, uneven veil. Not enough to hide large movement, enough to soften detail. Fish responded. Those that remained withdrew toward the far edge of the backwater, pressing closer to submerged roots and reed shadows where glare fractured least. They held lower now, deeper, more cautious. The heron tracked them without moving his feet. His head shifted slightly, following the faintest signs, a flicker of tail, a brief pressure wave where something turned against the weak current. but each potential target remained just outside optimal distance. Time worked against precision. As the day advanced, insects rose more frequently from the surface, touching down briefly before lifting again. Their disturbance broke the water's surface unpredictably, scattering false signals. Each ripple mimicked movement below, demanding evaluation and dismissal. The heron ignored most of them. He did not strike at opportunity alone. He struck at clarity. The current, once quiet and folded, began to reassert itself subtly, not as speed, but as direction. Water that had circled inward now slipped outward along the bank, carrying scent and information away instead of returning it. This mattered. Fish no longer lingered. They passed through the backwater instead of holding within it, using it briefly and then moving on. The pocket was losing its function. The heron adjusted posture. He lowered his raised leg into the water again, briefly testing temperature and flow. It had warmed slightly. Warm water reduced tolerance. It shortened the window for stillness. A fish appeared near the edge of vision. Larger than the first, but it did not pause. It crossed the backwater in a clean line, body angled forward, speed controlled, no hesitation. The heron tracked it for a moment, then let it pass. The angle was wrong. So was the timing. The heron had learned this place well enough to know when it stopped offering advantage. Staying too long turned patience into waste. He stepped backwards slowly, lifting each foot clear of the water before placing it again, minimizing disturbance. The backwater responded with only the smallest ripples. At the edge, he paused. The river beyond continued to move, louder, less forgiving. It offered more prey, but at higher cost. Wind touched its surface, breaking reflections and scattering information. The heron did not enter it yet. Instead, he turned slightly and followed the line of reeds upstream, searching for another pocket where current might slow again, where quiet could reform. Behind him, the backwater emptied. Not suddenly. Gradually. Water resumed its passage. Sediment settled fully. Fish moved on. What had been a place became simply part of the river again. The heron walked on with unhurried steps, body tall, head steady, carrying the understanding that success in still water was not about taking everything it offered, but about recognizing the exact moment when it stopped offering anything at all. The heron did not leave suddenly. There was no clear signal that announced the end, no sharp change in sound, no visible absence of fish. The decision formed slowly, shaped by accumulation rather than event. The backwater no longer held. It passed. He stood at the edge for several minutes longer than necessary, body still aligned with the water as if nothing had changed. This was not hesitation. It was confirmation. The surface no longer folded inward. Ripples travelled through instead of returning. Light flattened what little depth remained. Even the reeds along the bank shifted differently now, responding to flow rather than sheltering from it. The place had reverted. The heron stepped fully onto the bank. Mud pressed under his weight and released cleanly, leaving a shallow imprint that began to soften almost immediately as water seeped back in. He shook one leg gently, then the other, droplets falling without sound. He did not look back again. Walking upstream, he followed the river's edge with practiced economy, pausing occasionally to scan bends and indentations where current might lose itself again. He passed places that looked promising, but were not. Too fast, too shallow, too exposed. He did not stop at them. Experience narrowed choices more than hunger ever did. Further on, the river widened briefly, then narrowed again around a fallen tree half submerged near the bank. Water slowed there, curling around branches, forming a new pocket of quiet no larger than the one he had left. The heron paused. He did not enter it immediately. He watched. The current here was not quiet yet. It was learning how to slow. Debris gathered and released. Light fractured unevenly. Fish had not committed. The heron stood back and waited, not because he expected a strike soon, but because waiting itself cost little here. The river would either offer something again, or it would not. Both outcomes were acceptable. Behind him, the earlier backwater no longer existed in any meaningful way. It had dissolved into flow, leaving no trace of what it had briefly been. This was how the river worked. It did not remember, it did not repeat, it rearranged. The heron remained still, neck relaxed, eyes open, body balanced between movement and rest. He had eaten, he had learned, he had not overreached. When the light shifted again and the current finally slowed around the fallen tree, he stepped forward without urgency, placing one leg into the water and drawing the other up beneath him. The river quieted, not everywhere, not for long, but enough, and the heron stood within it, ready again, knowing that still water was never permanent, only borrowed, and that knowing when to leave mattered as much as knowing when to strike.